In the year 1095, a single voice would echo across medieval Europe, carrying words that would drench the Holy Land in blood for 2 centuries. Pope Urban II stood before thousands at the Council of Clermont, his words cutting through the cold French air like a blade. God wills it, he declared, and with those 3 words, he unleashed something that would forever change the course of human history. The medieval world was one of profound faith, where heaven and hell felt as real as the stones beneath men's feet. For Christians, Jerusalem wasn't just a distant city, it was the beating heart of their salvation, the place where Christ had walked, suffered, and died. But Jerusalem had fallen to Muslim rule 4 centuries earlier, and now, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I was pleading for help against the advancing Seljuk Turks. Urban saw opportunity in crisis. The warrior class of Europe had been tearing itself apart in endless feudal wars. What if their violence could be redirected? What if their swords could serve God instead of destroying Christendom from within? The Pope's words were intoxicating. He promised complete remission of sins for those who took up the cross. Paradise awaited those who died in service to God. The poor would find riches in the east. The landless would claim new territories. For nobles drowning in debt, for peasants crushed by famine, for younger sons with no inheritance, the Crusades offered hope wrapped in holy purpose. But Urban's speech contained something darker. He painted Muslims as defilers of sacred places, as enemies of Christ who deserved no mercy. He spoke of Jerusalem's stones crying out for Christian liberation. In that moment, he transformed military conquest into divine mission, turning warfare into worship. The response was overwhelming. Across Europe, men began sewing red crosses onto their clothing. Deus vult, God wills it, became the battle cry of a movement that would consume generations. What followed was chaos masquerading as holy purpose. Before the official armies could organize, a wave of popular crusading erupted across Europe. Peter the Hermit, a charismatic preacher, led thousands of peasants eastward in what history would remember as the People's Crusade. They were untrained, unequipped, and unprepared for the journey ahead. Their path to Jerusalem was paved with horror. Jewish communities across the Rhineland became targets of mob violence. Why, the Crusaders asked, should we travel thousands of miles to fight enemies of Christ when his betrayers live among us? Entire Jewish populations were massacred in cities like Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. The crusade that promised to reclaim the Holy Land began by destroying holy people in Europe itself. Most of these early crusaders never reached Jerusalem. They died of disease, starvation, or were slaughtered by Turkish forces in Anatolia. Their bones littered the road to the Holy Land, a grim preview of the carnage to come. When the official crusading armies finally departed in 1096, they represented the flower of European knighthood. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, names that would be sung in epic poems for generations. These were not mere adventurers but men who genuinely believed they were soldiers of Christ, inheritors of a divine mission. Their journey was a trial by fire. They crossed hostile territories, endured blazing deserts, and laid siege to fortified cities. At Antioch, they themselves were besieged for months, reduced to eating leather and grass. Some began to see visions, saints appeared on the battlefield, encouraging them to fight on. Others simply broke, abandoning the cross and fleeing home in shame. But somehow, impossibly, they persevered. In June 1099, after 3 years of unimaginable hardship, the Crusaders finally stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The sight that greeted the Crusaders in June 1099 would have tested the faith of lesser men. Jerusalem rose before them like a vision from Scripture, its golden dome of the rock catching the desert sun, its massive walls seeming to stretch toward heaven itself. But between the Christian army and their holy prize lay one of the most formidable fortifications in the medieval world. The city's Fatimid governor, Iftikhar al-Dawla, had prepared well for this moment. He had poisoned wells around the city, stockpiled food and weapons, and expelled most of the Christian population to reduce the number of mouths to feed. The walls were thick, the defenders determined, and the summer heat was merciless. For the Crusaders, already weakened by 3 years of constant warfare, the siege became a race against time and their own mortality. They had no siege engines, little food, and the nearest source of fresh water was miles away. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion while trying to fill the moats. Others died from dysentery and fever. Some began to whisper that perhaps God had abandoned them at the very threshold of their goal. Then, in late June, Genoese ships arrived at the port of Jaffa carrying precious cargo, timber, rope, and most crucially, engineers who knew how to build siege towers. The Crusaders tore apart the ships themselves, carrying the wood piece by piece across the desert to Jerusalem's walls. Working through scorching days and cold nights, they constructed 2 massive wooden towers and a collection of catapults. On July 15, 1099, the final assault began. The siege towers rolled toward the walls as arrows darkened the sky above them. Crusaders climbed scaling ladders while defenders poured boiling oil and hurled stones from above. For hours, the outcome hung in balance. Then, at midday, Godfrey of Bouillon's men succeeded in lowering a drawbridge from their siege tower onto the northern wall. The first Crusaders stepped onto the battlements of Jerusalem. Within moments, the defenses collapsed like a dam bursting. Gates were thrown open from the inside. The Crusader army poured into the holy city like a flood. What followed would stain the stones of Jerusalem with a darkness that time could never wash away. What happened when Jerusalem fell still echoes through history like a scream. For 3 days, the Crusaders slaughtered everyone they could find, Muslim, Jewish, and even Eastern Christians who looked too foreign. The streets ran red with blood. Chroniclers wrote that men rode through gore that reached their horses' bridles. In the Dome of the Rock, Muslims who had sought sanctuary were butchered where they prayed. The synagogue where Jews had barricaded themselves was burned with everyone inside. Children were torn from their mothers' arms and dashed against stones. The city that 3 great faiths held sacred became a charnel house. The Crusaders themselves saw divine justice in the massacre. They knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, their armor still stained with blood, and wept tears of joy. They had reclaimed Christ's city. God had given them victory. The slaughter wasn't murder, it was purification. But the Muslim world would not remain passive forever. For decades, Islamic rulers had been divided, more concerned with fighting each other than confronting the Frankish invaders. That changed with the rise of leaders like Zengi, and later, his son Nur al-Din, who began preaching their own holy war, jihad, against the Crusader states. The fall of Edessa in 1144 shocked Europe into launching the Second Crusade. 2 kings, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, led their armies east, only to meet with disaster. The Second Crusade achieved nothing but death and disillusionment. Then came Saladin. Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub was everything the Crusaders weren't: disciplined, honorable, and genuinely pious. He united Egypt and Syria under his rule, then turned his attention to the divided Crusader kingdoms. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, he destroyed the largest Crusader army ever assembled and recaptured Jerusalem with a mercy that put Christian conquerors to shame. Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem triggered the Third Crusade, the most famous of all the holy wars. 3 kings took the cross: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. Epic confrontations awaited: Christian against Muslim, East against West, 2 different concepts of holy war colliding on the battlefields of Palestine. Frederick drowned crossing a river in Anatolia, his army dissolving without their emperor. Philip and Richard quarreled constantly, their personal animosities undermining the Crusades' goals. But Richard proved himself a brilliant military commander, winning victory after victory against Saladin's forces. Yet for all his tactical genius, Richard could never recapture Jerusalem. The 2 great warriors, Richard and Saladin, came to respect each other as honorable enemies, but neither could deliver the decisive blow. The Third Crusade ended not with glorious victory but with a negotiated truce that allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem while leaving the city in Muslim hands. When the last Crusader stronghold at Acre fell in 1291, the age of the Crusades formally ended. But their legacy lived on in the collective memory of both East and West. For Europeans, the Crusades became romanticized as the epitome of medieval chivalry, inspiring literature, art, and later, imperial adventures in the Middle East. For Muslims, the Crusades represented the first great confrontation with Western imperialism, a memory that would be invoked centuries later during colonial struggles and modern conflicts. The word Crusader itself became a term of accusation, a shorthand for Western aggression against the Islamic world. The Crusades revealed both the best and worst of medieval humanity. Genuine faith mixed with naked greed. As the centuries passed, the Crusades devolved into something far removed from their original purpose. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land at all. Instead, Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. The Children's Crusade saw thousands of young people sold into slavery. Later crusades became thinly veiled exercises in political opportunism and territorial expansion. The human cost was staggering. Millions died over 2 centuries of intermittent warfare. Entire populations were displaced, cities destroyed, cultures obliterated. The sophisticated Islamic civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean, which had preserved and advanced Greek learning while Europe struggled through the Dark Ages, was traumatized by repeated invasions. Jewish communities across Europe faced centuries of intensified persecution as crusading ideology took root. The Crusades didn't just target Muslims, they unleashed a wave of religious hatred that would poison interfaith relations for generations to come. Standing in the ruins of Crusader castles today, or walking through the narrow streets of Jerusalem's Old City, we are confronted with a troubling truth: the most destructive conflicts in human history have often been fought in the name of the most sacred ideals. The Crusades were not simply medieval history, they were a preview of the religious and ideological wars that would plague humanity for centuries to come. They showed how easily faith could be weaponized, how quickly divine love could transform into human hatred. But perhaps their most important lesson is this: when we convince ourselves that God is on our side, when we transform our enemies into demons and our causes into crusades, we lose something essentially human. The Crusaders who wept in thanksgiving over the corpses of Jerusalem's children were not monsters, they were ordinary people who had allowed their highest beliefs to justify their darkest impulses. The sacred and the profane, the divine and the human, heaven and hell, all collided in those dusty streets of the Holy Land, and in that collision, we see reflected not just the medieval world, but ourselves. For the capacity for both transcendent good and unspeakable evil lies within us all, waiting to be awakened by the right words, the right cause, the right holy war. The armor grows cold. The banners fade. The songs of glory become whispers in the wind. But the questions the Crusades raised about faith, violence, and human nature remain as urgent today as they were 900 years ago, when a pope's voice first echoed across Europe with the promise of paradise and the reality of hell.